It only took 11 seconds of silence. That's how long J.D. Vance stood there, unmoving, on live national television. No words, no comeback, just the weight of a lifetime pressing against his chest. 9 million people watched as AOC, calm, confident, leaned forward and said, "Faith might comfort the weak, but we need facts, not fairy tales." The room laughed. The host moved on, but JD didn't, because when you've nearly taken your own life at 12, when you've found your mother unconscious more times than you've said, "I love you," faith isn't a fairy tale. It's the only reason you're still standing. And when JD finally spoke, after those 11 unbearable seconds, he didn't argue. He told a story, a true broken story, and something in that room changed. Even those who hated him stopped breathing. Now, some parts of this story are dramatized, but the pain, the silence, the resilience, that's as real as it gets for millions of Americans who've lived through what politics so often overlooks. Why did one fractured memory from JD's past leave even his fiercest critics speechless? Stay with us, because what happened next might change how you see faith, politics, and America itself. The camera didn't just roll, it roared to life. Red, white, and blue spotlights sliced through the dim studio haze as millions of Americans leaned in from their living rooms, some gripping coffee mugs, others folding arms with quiet tension. On stage, two podiums waited, identical in height, but tonight they wouldn't feel equal. From the left side of the stage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered like a headline come to life, shoulders back, confidence radiating, heels clicking like punctuation marks. A burst of applause erupted, especially from younger audience members standing near the front. AOC paused at center stage, offering a camera-ready smile that didn't just say, "I belong here." It said, "I'm already writing tomorrow's headlines." Seconds later, from the opposite curtain, J.D. Vance stepped into the light, not as thunderous, not as sleek, but carrying something older, something quieter, a gravity. He wore a navy jacket that looked like it had survived 100 town halls, and his slow nod to the audience carried the weight of people who rarely get seen, let alone heard. The applause was respectful, less flashy, but oddly warmer, like folks clapping for someone they'd worked beside in a factory line, or someone who'd held their father's hand in hospice. Tonight's debate wasn't just policy, it was identity. Title on screen, "Policy and People, the Next American Chapter." At stake, a controversial recovery bill, pitched as a nationwide economic reboot for middle America, veterans and declining towns, but criticized for its cultural clauses. Faith-based grants, traditional family credits, and tax breaks tied to skilled labor over college degrees. In the words of one New York op-ed, "Is this help, or is it a step backward?" Moderators introduced both guests briskly. AOC smiled, waved, made a quick quip about JD's best-selling book title being "Far Too Humble." Laughter. JD replied dryly, "And your title, Congresswoman, is far too popular." A pause, surprised chuckle, one or two coughs. JD didn't flinch, but already the difference was clear. AOC was a storm, clever, rhythmic, fluent in television. JD Vance was a mountain, unmoved, deliberate, almost inconveniently sincere. As the debate began, AOC leaned forward, opening with a powerful statement about cultural equity, reproductive freedom, and faith being used as a shield for control. She quoted statistics, cited peer-reviewed journals, named 3 Harvard economists. JD listened without interruption, his hands folded slowly. His eyes scanned the studio crowd, not the moderator. When it was his turn, he didn't raise his voice. "My faith," he said softly, "wasn't born in church. It was born in the sound of my grandmother's lungs as she coughed herself awake at 3 a.m. after a double shift in Middletown, Ohio. I didn't go to Yale to save America from her. I went because of her." Silence. Even AOC blinked. It was not a mic drop. It was something heavier. But before the moderator could move on, AOC leaned in. "JD," she said with that now famous grin, "what you call tradition, others might call regression. Faith should never write law. And your grandmother's sacrifice doesn't excuse policies that silence others. JD didn't answer. Yet. And that pause, just 2 seconds too long, sparked something visceral in the audience. Some clutched their chests, others shook their heads. On Twitter, hashtags were already forming. Hashtag FaithVsFreedom, hashtag JDVers AOC, hashtag Heartland Heat. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was becoming something else. Because tonight, two Americas didn't just meet, they collided. And only one would walk away with the microphone still in their hands. The moderator barely had time to reset his papers when AOC leaned in again, this time with sharper edges. Her tone was still wrapped in poise, but now, every word carried the precision of a needle. "Let's be honest," she said, flashing her practiced smile to the cameras. "We're not here to exchange lullabies from the Rust Belt. We're here to shape policy. And policy should be driven by data, not nostalgia." The audience stirred. Some nodded, some folded their arms. JD, still standing steady, gave the smallest of nods. "Data," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word in his mouth. "You know, I don't mind data. I've studied it. I've lived it. But when you've watched your community collapse, not in a textbook, but outside your front door, numbers can't tell the whole story." AOC tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "And yet those communities you speak of, when they vote, they don't always vote for solutions. They vote for symbols. Symbols rooted in faith-driven romanticism." That word, romanticism, it hung in the air like a challenge. JD didn't flinch, but his eyes met hers now, direct, calm, unblinking. "Maybe that's because we believe that the dignity of a man isn't just measured by income. Maybe we believe that character, family, faith, they matter in a republic. Not everything moral fits neatly on a spreadsheet." There was a faint murmur from the audience. Someone clapped, a short burst, quickly swallowed by the hush that followed. The moderator shifted uncomfortably. AOC struck. "And maybe," she said, her voice now sharp enough to cut through steel, "we need economic models, not Sunday school sermons." Laughter rippled across the studio, controlled but real. JD stood motionless. 1 second, 2, 3. The camera cut to him, his face still, gaze slightly downward. 4, 5, 6. AOC adjusted her mic, smirked. 7, 8. The crowd's tension shifted. What began as chuckling started to feel inappropriate, like maybe the joke had gone too far. 9, 10. JD finally looked up, slowly, deliberately. 11 seconds of silence, and not the awkward kind, the kind that echoes. His voice came low, unrushed. "Congresswoman, I didn't come here to preach, but I did come here with a question. Why is it that every time someone speaks from a place of faith, you act like they're asking you to go to church?" A murmur. Louder this time. People glanced at each other. Some looked toward AOC, others back at JD. He took a breath. "I talk about Sunday school not because I want to convert anyone, but because that's where I learned that power without compassion is just cruelty dressed in a suit. And if this nation is going to move forward, it's going to need more than numbers. It's going to need soul." A hush fell so deep you could hear a pen drop on the moderator's desk. For the first time, AOC didn't answer immediately. Her smile twitched, less confident now. There was a glint of something else in her eyes. Was it annoyance or recognition? She leaned back ever so slightly. JD didn't press further. He didn't need to. The room had shifted, from laughter to stillness, from policy to something far more human. JD's last words still echoed faintly as the air seemed to settle around them. AOC didn't respond, not immediately. The moderator, sensing a turning point, gave a small nod, an invitation to JD if he wanted it. He took it, but not with facts, not with figures. What came next wasn't argument, it was memory. "I didn't choose faith," JD began, his voice quieter now, pulling the audience toward him. "Faith chose me, or maybe it found me when I was 12 years old, sitting in a freezing kitchen in Middletown, Ohio." His eyes weren't on AOC anymore. They were looking somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the cameras, into a corner of his past that none of them could see, but all of them began to feel. It was January, snow outside, ice on the inside of the window. I hadn't eaten dinner. I was waiting for my mom, again. The kitchen smelled like cold and cigarettes and canned spaghetti. That night I climbed onto the roof, 14 feet high. Not tall enough to die quickly, but tall enough, I thought, to stop the noise. He paused and the silence deepened. My shoes slipped a little on the shingles. I remember thinking how strange it was that I was worried about falling before I decided to fall. But then I heard it, faint but clear. My mother inside the house, lying on the living room floor. She wasn't awake, not really. The pills had taken her somewhere far. But I heard her, whispering. JD's throat caught for a moment. The audience leaned in, not physically but emotionally, somewhere between breath and prayer. She said, "God, please don't let my son die like me." He let that line sit, untouched. AOC's expression had shifted, less composed now, not defensive, but human. JD's voice dropped again, gentler. I didn't know what I believed that night. I just knew that someone, even someone barely conscious, believed there was still something to save in me. That's what faith was. Not a sermon, not a slogan, just a whisper in the dark. No one moved. Not even the moderator. He continued slowly. So when I talk about faith, I'm not asking anyone to kneel. I'm just telling you where I found my spine, where I found the reason not to jump. It wasn't politics, it wasn't policy. It was a woman who had nothing left but one last broken prayer. A few sniffles echoed in the quiet. The camera panned gently. Audience members stared forward, caught somewhere between reflection and disbelief. Even AOC, so quick-witted moments ago, blinked slowly, lips parted but silent. JD exhaled, as if releasing something he hadn't meant to share, but couldn't stop once it began. I'm not ashamed of that story, because I know there's a 12-year-old boy somewhere in this country right now, looking out a window at a rooftop, wondering if anyone sees him. And if I can reach that boy, not with a law, not with a tax credit, but with the truth that someone once saw me, then maybe politics is still worth something. The moderator lowered his head. Even the technicians behind the cameras didn't speak, and in that fragile quiet, the entire room seemed to recalibrate, not around opinion or ideology, but something far harder to define. AOC shifted slightly in her seat. Her hands, once resting confidently on the desk, were now clasped. JD looked up, not in triumph, but in resolution. The debate was still ongoing, the policies still pending, but the temperature had changed. The crowd no longer watched to cheer or laugh. They watched to understand. And J.D. Vance, once the man they mocked for bringing Sunday school to the Senate floor, had just reminded them all what silence could say when wielded with truth. But what J.D. didn't say on that stage, what the cameras couldn't capture, was everything that came before that night on the roof. Because the silence he held for 11 seconds didn't just rise from that one moment of despair. It was built over years, layered like sediment in a boy's heart. And it began with the sound of doors slamming in a small crumbling house just outside Middletown, Ohio. He was 9 the first time he saw his mother's eyes go glassy mid-sentence. The words slurring, the rage coming out sideways. The kitchen table would shake, not from anger, but from the sudden weight of her collapse. A milk glass shattered on the floor. JD didn't flinch. He just cleaned it up. Mornings smelled like vodka and pharmacy bottles. Nights came too quickly, and through it all, JD became the quietest thing in the house, trying to keep the noise inside her from getting louder. He didn't know who God really was. He only knew the name. It was scribbled in the corner of a crumpled Bible he found under a pile of laundry. But one night, curled on the bathroom floor with the door locked and the lights off, he whispered that name like it was a secret passcode to a better place. "God," he said softly, "if you're real, just don't let her die tonight." No answer came, just the sound of her coughing in the hallway, then silence again. The school called often. Teachers said he was distant but bright. He always had his homework done, because it was the only thing he could control. But there were days when JD sat alone at lunch, drawing maps of places he'd never been, places where mothers smiled and stoves worked and no one screamed over broken remote controls. He never told anyone what it was really like. Except once. There was a neighbor, Miss Delia. She lived 2 doors down, made cornbread that could melt in your mouth, and had eyes that looked like they already knew everything. One day after finding JD sitting on her porch steps, with a bruised lip and a backpack he wouldn't let go of, she sat beside him without asking questions. Just offered a glass of water and half a slice of pie. "You don't have to say anything, baby," she said after a while. "But if you ever wonder why God doesn't fix what's broken, maybe it's because sometimes he just wants to make sure you survive it." JD didn't understand that at the time, but those words stayed with him, like stitches you couldn't see, holding parts of him together that kept wanting to fall apart. The chaos at home didn't vanish. His mother's recovery came in brief flashes, 2 weeks clean, then a relapse, a new boyfriend, a new fight, another set of locks on the doors. But JD endured, not because he was brave, but because he'd already learned how to disappear inside himself and still find a way back. He found comfort in books, escape in school, and an odd sense of responsibility, as if holding everything together, even in silence, was his quiet contract with the world. Years later, when the cameras rolled and AOC's words cut into his faith like a knife through glass, JD didn't flinch because he'd already lived through worse storms. And when he paused for those 11 seconds on national television, it wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was because sometimes silence is where we go to remember who we really are. And JD Vance, standing on that stage, wasn't just a senator or a former Marine or the author of a best-selling book. He was still, in some way, that 12-year-old boy on the roof, the one who heard a whisper in the dark, the one who survived. And the audience didn't know it yet, but that survival was about to become the heart of a story that would leave the nation speechless. And just when the air in the auditorium seemed too heavy to breathe, AOC leaned forward, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, eyes sharp as glass. She wasn't one to let silence dictate the pace. Not when cameras were rolling, not when millions were watching. With practiced poise and the cadence of someone raised in the art of oration, she offered a half-smile that barely concealed the tightness in her voice. "Mr. Vance," she began, "we admire your strength. Truly, your story is moving. But let's be clear, policy should uplift all, not lean on personal anecdotes." The words landed softly but carried an edge. Some in the audience nodded in agreement. Others stiffened. It was a rhetorical move, pivoting the narrative from empathy to ideology. But JD didn't blink. He stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of him, and let the moment hang for just a second longer than comfortable. Then came the reply, quiet at first, but steady, weighted, unmistakably deliberate. "Personal experience," JD said, "is the data Washington forgot." You could hear the inhale from the front row. A murmur rippled across the studio. Not a cheer, not outrage, something subtler, a recognition. Because in those 7 words, something clicked for the viewers at home, especially for those who had ever watched the factory close, the lights go out, or a family member disappear into addiction with no hotline that called back. JD didn't just answer her argument. He reframed the battlefield. He wasn't playing defense anymore. For the next few minutes, the debate shifted in tone. AOC pressed harder, bringing up economic indicators, tax codes, housing equity models, even citing a recent Brookings report. But something in her rhythm faltered. JD no longer looked like the man who'd been caught off guard. He looked like someone who had nothing left to prove, and that unsettled her more than she expected. "I don't disagree with data," JD said calmly, "but numbers without stories are like policies without people. That's how we get spreadsheets full of success and towns full of despair." There it was again, that bridge between the abstract and the personal, between Washington and Waverly, Youngstown, Harlan, the places that didn't trend on Twitter, the places where faith wasn't theater, it was survival. Somewhere backstage, a producer was already mouthing, "Clip this." Social media managers were scrambling. Within minutes, the exchange had been sliced, captioned, and posted. On Facebook, the quote racked up 200,000 shares in under an hour. On YouTube, someone titled the clip, J.D. Vance just made AOC regret laughing at Faith. Even those who disagreed with him politically couldn't deny one thing. J.D. Vance had connected. He didn't look angry. He didn't sound triumphant. He looked like a man who'd carried too many coffins, some literal, some metaphorical, and just didn't have time for games anymore. The comment sections lit up. I felt that in my bones. My dad could have said those same words. He lived it. We're not statistics, we're people. Thank you, J.D. Even seasoned pundits looked momentarily unsure how to respond. The debate wasn't just about policy anymore. It had become something more intimate, more volatile, a referendum on whether pain could be a legitimate credential in America's highest conversations. And as the commercial break hit, viewers didn't move. They didn't stretch or scroll away. They stayed, eyes wide, breath held. Because something rare had just happened. A debate had stopped being a performance and started feeling like the truth. The lights dimmed just slightly as the moderator glanced at his cue cards, perhaps hoping the last viral exchange would signal a natural pause. But J.D. Vance wasn't finished. Not yet. Not when millions were watching. Not when his story still had a breath left in it. He leaned gently into the microphone, no longer with the posture of a debater, but of a man speaking directly to someone he once was, alone, uncertain, unseen. You see, J.D. said, faith isn't a talking point for me. It's the reason I'm standing here tonight. The room stilled. Even the moderator froze, sensing something shift. Not theatrics, not strategy, but testimony. J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He just spoke, as if telling the truth was the only thing left worth doing. I was 17, he continued. Too angry for college, too broke for escape, too invisible for anyone to care. I didn't go to law school because I believed in the system. I went because a youth pastor, someone I barely knew, told me I had a mind worth something. He handed me a tattered paperback copy of the Constitution and said, "This isn't just for the privileged. Make it yours." The audience was silent again, not in politeness, but in quiet absorption. That faith, J.D. said, sent me to the Marines. I didn't sign up out of patriotism. I signed up to survive. But somewhere between Iraq and Kentucky, something else grew. Discipline, resilience, and a fire I didn't know I had. AOC shifted in her seat. Not dramatically, just enough for the cameras to notice. Her eyes narrowed, not in contempt but calculation. This wasn't the J.D. Vance from campaign ads. This was a man who had walked through fire and refused to let the smoke define him. I didn't choose politics because I wanted power, J.D. added. I chose it because I got tired of watching kids from towns like mine disappear. Into drugs, into jails, into graves. And you know what hurts most? It's not the poverty. It's not even the pain. It's the feeling that no one thinks you're worth saving. Then came the line, the kind that doesn't just echo across the stage, but lodges itself in hearts. I'm not here to convert anyone. I'm here to remind you that not all kids get second chances unless we build a system that believes in them, even when they don't. It landed like a stone in still water. Not explosive, just honest. And the ripples were immediate. A woman in the second row blinked hard, her fingers tightening around the program in her lap. A man in the back, wearing a UAW hat, gave a slow nod. On Twitter, the clip was already being titled, "The Moment That Changed the Room." AOC looked momentarily unsteady. She was brilliant, no doubt, armed with policies, data, and relentless drive. But for the first time tonight, she seemed like the one catching up. Her rebuttal stalled in her throat. Even the moderator hesitated. He cleared his voice, eyes darting to the producer's signal just off camera. "We'll take a brief break," he said, voice clipped, trying to regain control. But the moment had already taken root. The room didn't move. Viewers at home didn't blink. The debate wasn't just policy anymore. It was soul against cynicism, memory against mechanism, pain against politeness. And the battle lines weren't just ideological now. They were personal, intimate, etched into the stories of people who had waited too long for their lives to matter in rooms like this one. And when the stage lights faded for the break, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of reckoning. The break barely lasted 60 seconds before the airwaves exploded. No sooner had J.D. Vance's final words, "Unless we build a system that believes in them," reached the ears of viewers than political panels coast to coast scrambled to respond. The screen split into boxes, studio lights flickered on, and across the country, analysts lined up not just to interpret the moment, but to weaponize it. On one channel, a progressive commentator with horn-rimmed glasses smirked before speaking. "We've seen this play before," she said, tapping her pen against a stack of printouts. "When policy gets shaky, they pivot to parables." J.D. Vance isn't offering legislation. He's selling redemption arcs. Faith is not a substitute for facts. Another panelist chimed in. He used a childhood trauma to make his point. But let's not forget, personal stories don't build bridges or fix inflation. They distract. On a rival network, the tone was wildly different. A conservative anchor leaned forward with intensity, eyes wide beneath a banner that now read, "Vance speaks for the forgotten." "What we witnessed wasn't performance," the anchor declared. "That was authenticity." J.D. Vance just reminded America that data without compassion is dead policy. He wasn't asking for applause. He was asking Washington to remember the people it left behind. Clips began circulating at warp speed. One featured J.D.'s line, "I didn't choose faith. It chose me the night my mother almost died." It garnered over 3 million views in under an hour. Another, showing AOC's uneasy shift in posture during his speech, was slowed down, analyzed frame by frame, and spliced into a dozen different interpretations. But something more subtle and more seismic was happening beyond the studios. In Rust Belt towns from Middletown to Youngstown, the phones began to buzz. A woman named Cheryl in Lorraine tweeted, "I ain't cried watching politics since my husband passed. But J.D., he spoke for folks like us." A high school principal in Steubenville wrote, "Say what you want, but kids in my school need someone in D.C. who remembers what it's like to be overlooked." A retired welder posted a grainy photo of himself with his grandson and simply wrote, "He gets it. He gets us." It wasn't just sympathy, it was ownership. J.D.'s story didn't just touch a nerve, it tapped a reservoir. Inside AOC's green room, the mood was tighter, quieter. Her team huddled, faces illuminated by live updates from social feeds. A young aide whispered what others didn't dare say. "The moment's catching fire. We need to steer this back to policy before it becomes about pain." AOC, sharp-eyed and breathing slow, nodded. She knew the terrain. She'd risen from activism, forged her way through fields of skepticism, and never once let narrative overpower message. But tonight, something was shifting, and fast. She walked back to the podium, posture tall, spine straight. But there was an edge now. Not panic, not pride, just calculation. When the cameras resumed, she opened without greeting. "Let's be clear," she said. "We admire strength, we respect struggle. But national policy should not lean on personal pain. It should lift all people, not hinge on anecdotes." J.D. didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. Because while Washington argued semantics, something else had already taken root in living rooms across the Midwest. J.D.'s silence, his story, his scar, none of it required permission to resonate. And no analyst, no matter how credentialed, could undo what a single honest sentence had seeded in the minds of working-class America. The debate was no longer confined to the stage. It was echoing far beyond it. The applause was still fading when the lights sharpened back onto the stage. AOC adjusted the mic with a practiced calm, but behind her composed exterior, there was steel. She had listened, absorbed, calculated, and now she was ready to strike, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The narrative was slipping, and she knew it. If she didn't seize it back now, the night wouldn't be remembered for policy, it would be remembered for pain. She spoke with crisp authority. "Let's get one thing straight," she began, her voice firm, her hands steady on the podium. "No amount of pain, however heartfelt, grants policy authority. Trauma doesn't write legislation. Compassion, while noble, doesn't pay wages." There was a pause, measured, intentional. She glanced across the audience as scanning for resonance. Government needs to be rigorous. It needs data, structure, accountability, not sentimentality. If we make decisions based on who has the most tragic story, We're not building a republic, we're scripting a memoir. The crowd rumbled, some nodding in approval, others shifting uneasily. It was a classic pivot. Take back the high ground, reframe the terms. For a moment it worked. But then, something broke the rhythm. JD, until now a portrait of quiet restraint, raised his hand halfway and spoke before being invited. The moderator barely had time to react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match her fire. But his interruption cut like a knife wrapped in velvet. Maybe, he said slowly, cold reason without compassion is exactly why so many towns in America feel like graveyards. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. The words struck with eerie precision. The room for a heartbeat stilled. Then the ripple began, applause erupting like flint struck in dry brush. It wasn't just clapping, it was an exhale. Like the audience had been waiting for someone to finally say it. JD didn't gloat. He didn't gesture. He let the echo of his words carry their own weight. AOC blinked, not out of surprise but recalibration. She knew an effective counterpunch when she heard it, and this one was dangerous, not because it attacked her ideas, but because it bypassed them. Went straight to the gut. Still, she was too seasoned to show blood. She leaned forward slightly. You talk about graveyards, she said, voice lower now. But do you know what else fills them? A lack of health care, gun violence, climate disasters, all while politicians sit in rooms and cry about their past instead of fixing the future. There was tension now, not animosity, but a raw, almost electric current in the air. The debate was no longer about policies. It was about vision, about what America needed more, structure or soul. The moderator, sensing the moment fray, stepped in. Let's reset, he said. We're going to shift to infrastructure and jobs in just a moment. But I want to give each of you one sentence, just one, to summarize what you believe tonight is truly about. He nodded to JD. JD's voice was calm. It's about whether we build a country that knows numbers, or one that remembers names. Then to AOC. Her eyes didn't leave JD as she replied, it's about whether we have the courage to move forward or the comfort of staying in the past. And with that, the moderator turned to camera, signaling the next segment. But no one noticed, because in that brief exchange, something more profound had occurred. The battle lines were no longer ideological, they were emotional. And the audience, both in the hall and across the country, wasn't just watching anymore. They were choosing sides. The studio hadn't quite settled since the last exchange. The audience was still absorbing the emotional undercurrents, the commentators in their booths scrambling to adjust their notes for the post-debate analysis. Something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The room no longer felt like a stage for policy. It felt like a battleground for soul. Judge D stood quietly at his podium, fingers lightly resting on its edges. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He looked unburdened in a way, like a man who had decided that the truth was more valuable than the win. Then, without waiting for the next question, he looked away from AOC and turned, not to the moderator, but to the camera, directly, deliberately. Before we go any further, JD said, voice steady but raw around the edges, I need to show you something. The room tensed. Even AOC seemed caught off guard, brows knitting slightly as she glanced toward the producers. This wasn't scripted. JD continued, his gaze still locked into the lens. I've shared stories tonight about growing up in Middletown, about faith, about survival, and I get it. Some of you might be rolling your eyes thinking, here we go again, another politician peddling pain. He took a breath, long and heavy. If my faith bothers you, fine. If you think it clouds my logic or makes me unfit to govern, I won't convince you in a soundbite. But before you dismiss it, before you write me off as just another Bible-toting Republican with a chip on his shoulder, there's someone you need to meet. He stepped away from the podium, just slightly, as if the moment required physical distance from the script, from the artifice. You need to meet the woman who taught me how to live through fire. Silence fell, thicker than any applause. JD didn't elaborate, didn't soften it with a smile or a backstory. He simply nodded once, to the producers off stage, and returned to his place. The moderator blinked, clearly caught between protocol and instinct. AOC glanced toward her team in the shadows, as if questioning what exactly was about to happen. The overhead lights dimmed, and then, for the first time all evening, the screen behind the candidates went black. No sound, no music, no political banners, just darkness. And in bold white text, the debate will resume shortly. Online, the live stream chat exploded. Twitter lit up with questions. Who was she? What's the video? JD's grandmother? A teacher? A victim? A mistake? Everyone had a theory. Even inside the hall, the murmurs were audible now. The shift in tone wasn't just dramatic, it was surgical. JD hadn't answered AOC's last point. He hadn't rebutted her policies. He had done something more dangerous. He had redirected the emotional current of the night and dared the audience to follow him into the unknown. AOC stood motionless, her face unreadable. But her silence said more than words could have. She wasn't just surprised. She was cornered in an arena she hadn't expected. Personal legacy. The moderator, finally regaining composure, leaned into his mic. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief break before we continue. Please stay tuned. But no one moved. Not the audience, not the staff, not the people watching from living rooms and mobile phones across the country. Because it was clear now, this wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. And the next chapter wasn't going to be a talking point. It was going to be a revelation. The auditorium went dark, save for the glow of the screen behind JD. No sound at first, just the grainy timestamp in the bottom right corner. April 14th, 1999. Middletown Recovery Center. The footage was old, recorded on a camcorder with a shaky hand. In the frame sat a woman, thin, pale, her hair unkempt, and her hospital gown loose on her shoulders. Her eyes, though tired, shimmered with something that hadn't entirely left her. Recognition, maybe even a flicker of hope. It was JD's mother. She sat alone at a table, a piece of lined paper in her trembling hands. A nurse could be heard in the background, gently encouraging her. You can do it, Deb. Just say it in your words. The woman nodded slowly, sniffled, then began to read. Her voice was raspy and cracked from years of substance abuse, but her words struck clear. JD, she began, stopping almost immediately as tears overtook her. She wiped her face with her sleeve, composing herself. JD, I don't deserve your love. The audience in the auditorium was utterly still. Even the usual background hum of shuffling feet and coughs had vanished. But your belief in God and in me, she continued, voice trembling again, made me believe again. She lowered the letter briefly, letting the silence hang. Her eyes looked into the camera, not directly, but enough to draw everyone watching into that old sterile room. I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there when you needed me most, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make that right. Another pause, the screen flickered as the tape adjusted focus. But when I saw you pray for me, even when I was at my worst, when I heard you say that you forgave me, that you believed I could still get better, JD, that was the moment I stopped wanting to die. The nurse behind the camera could be heard quietly crying. I can't promise I'll never relapse, she whispered now, but I want to live. I want to be your mom. I want to see what you become. The image froze there, on her tear-streaked face, eyes wide with pain and hope in equal measure. Then the screen cut to black. For a moment, it was as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. The emotional weight was too thick to slice through with commentary or spin. Even the most seasoned analysts, watching from studio booths across the country, found themselves stunned into silence. Back in the debate hall, the lights slowly returned to full brightness. JD stood motionless. AOC stared ahead, her eyes locked on the now empty screen, as if trying to replay the video in her mind. And that's when it hit everyone. This wasn't just a political move. This was vulnerability weaponized, but not for power, for truth. JD didn't speak. He didn't need to. The audience didn't erupt into cheers. They didn't stand. They just sat, humbled, unsure where the line between debate and real life had just vanished. And in that uncertainty, something changed. Not about policy or platforms, but about people. Because behind every position, every speech, every soundbite, there are letters never mailed, prayers whispered in silence, and broken voices that still have something left to say. And America had just heard one of them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The stillness in the studio wasn't the kind that begged to be broken. It was reverent, palpable, the kind of silence that didn't feel like absence, but presence, a collective inhale, waiting to become something else. The moderator looked momentarily lost, fingers resting on the cue cards that now seemed irrelevant. Cameramen lowered their gear instinctively. In the press gallery above, seasoned journalists sat with their hands clasped or resting over their mouths. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply stared, caught in the weight of what they'd just witnessed. AOC sat still. Her body leaned slightly forward as if she'd forgotten the posture of performance. Her eyes were not on JD nor the audience. They were fixed on the black screen that had just faded to nothing, as if it still held something she hadn't fully absorbed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The fire that had lit her responses earlier, the rhythm of practiced, policy-perfect phrasing, was gone now, replaced by something rawer, unmasked. The camera drifted slowly across the audience. A woman in the third row pressed a hand to her chest. A man in a utility uniform nodded slowly, as if confirming something long felt but never heard aloud. An older couple held hands tightly, no tears, just a look between them that said they knew what it meant to survive something. Then came the first social media posts, quiet tributes from people watching at home. Just showed my teenage son this clip. We both cried. Thank you, JD. My mom fought addiction for 20 years. That video wasn't political. That was truth. This isn't about right or left. That's the first time I've seen someone on stage talk like we matter. From Appalachia to inner-city neighborhoods, from rusted factory towns to rural churches, viewers who'd long felt erased began sharing fragments of their own stories. Not political commentary, just quiet acknowledgments. Not everyone agreed with JD's politics, but in that moment, many felt he had spoken for something deeper than a party line. Inside the control room, producers exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. The segment would go viral before the next break, but even they hesitated to switch to commercial, unsure if such a sacred stillness should be interrupted by a toothpaste ad. AOC finally stirred. She reached for her glass of water, hand trembling ever so slightly. She didn't try to hide it. The moderator leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper, asking if she'd like to respond. AOC nodded slowly but didn't speak. She took a deep breath, her chest rising with the weight of it. Her fingers tapped against the podium in thought, not impatience, but searching. When she finally looked at JD, it wasn't the look of a rival. It was the look of someone seeing a man, not a politician. And that was perhaps the most unexpected moment of all. Because in a night built on argument, rebuttal, and carefully rehearsed attacks, a truce had momentarily descended, delicate, unspoken, but felt by all. Not agreement, not surrender, just recognition. A quiet understanding that behind every clash of ideals is a clash of lived experiences. And tonight, one of those experiences had cut through the noise, not to win, but to remind them all what this was really about. JD closed the laptop slowly, as if he were shutting a door on a room filled with ghosts. The click of the hinge echoed faintly through the studio, the only sound in a chamber that had become reverently quiet. He let his hands rest on the closed device for a moment, then looked up, not at AOC, not even at the moderator, but directly into the audience and then into the camera, straight through the lens and into the living rooms of millions. I didn't play that for politics, he said softly. I played it because she's one of millions. His voice didn't rise. There was no crescendo, no rhetorical flourish, just a plain-spoken truth, dropped like a stone into still water. JD stood straighter, the nerves of the earlier segments replaced by something calmer, anchored. I know some people think faith is a performance, and I don't blame them. A lot of folks have used it as a weapon or a mask. But for some of us, faith was the only thing that made sense when the world didn't. A few murmurs from the crowd, nods of understanding, rippled through the audience like wind in tall grass. This isn't about me, JD continued, his hands now gently moving for the first time, punctuating his words with small intentional gestures. It's about everyone who's ever been told their story didn't matter because it wasn't in a spreadsheet. It's about the kid who stays up all night because their mom's not home and the lights got cut off. It's about the dad who can't find work after the factory closed. It's about every person who's ever been told they're just a statistic, or worse, a burden. A long pause. His eyes search the room. They're not. They're human. And if we forget that, we lose more than policy. We lose our country. The words landed not like a punch, but like gravity. Heavy, inevitable. For a heartbeat, it was unclear what would follow. The silence held its breath. And then, a single clap far back in the audience. Then another. Then a few more, until the ripple became a wave. The crowd rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the studio, not raucous or performative, but full-bodied, rising from somewhere deeper than politics. JD didn't smile. He didn't bask. He simply stood there, absorbing the moment, perhaps unsure what to do with the very thing he hadn't come seeking. Validation. AOC remained seated. Her eyes were downcast, brows drawn together, not in frustration, but in reflection. Her hand tightened around her pen, then relaxed. She looked not at JD, but at the place where the laptop had rested moments ago, as if the image of that video still hovered in her mind. The camera caught her expression, measured, unreadable, but softened. A shift, subtle but real. Backstage, producers scrambled to rewrite the narrative of the evening. The control room was already buzzing, phones lighting up, staff whispering, executives sensing that what had just unfolded was no longer a segment, but a national moment. On social media, clips of JD's words were already circulating, captions like, "This isn't about me, it's about everyone. He brought faith without preaching, pain without pity. This just changed everything." The moderator finally stepped forward to regain control. "We'll now move to our next segment, but I think it's safe to say something important just happened here." JD gave a small nod, stepped back from the mic, and returned to his seat. His shoulders seemed heavier now, not from defeat, but from having opened something personal, raw, and unfiltered. The crowd slowly sat down, though the air didn't quite return to normal. Because normal had left the building, and the debate, from this point on, would never quite be the same. As the echoes of the standing ovation finally settled, JD remained still for a moment longer. Then, without a word, he stepped away from the center of the stage and returned to his podium. The moderator had barely caught their breath when JD reached beneath the lectern and pulled out a thick folder. Navy blue, its surface weathered by thumbprints and late nights. Stamped in gold block letters, the Broken Faith Protection Act. He placed it carefully on the podium. His voice when he spoke carried not just conviction, but precision. "This isn't just a story," JD said, gesturing toward the folder. "It's a legislative path forward, because the children we keep debating about, they don't need another televised argument. They need a plan." He opened the folder and held up a single-page summary. Camera zooming in, networks already scrambling to freeze frame. "The Broken Faith Protection Act," he continued, "was drafted in partnership with trauma psychologists, public school counselors, and, yes, local church networks who've been feeding, sheltering, and listening to these kids long before Washington even knew their names." A quiet buzz stirred among the journalists in the press gallery. This wasn't symbolic. This was infrastructure. And no one, not even AOC, had seen it coming. JD outlined the 3 pillars. First, he said, nationwide trauma counseling centers in every county with high overdose rates, funded through redirected opioid settlement payouts. Not charity. Accountability. He tapped the page once, letting the impact settle. Second, federal faith community grants. Not for proselytizing, but for crisis intervention, after-school safety, meals, and emergency housing. If we claim to care about mental health, we can't keep excluding the institutions that are already showing up. There were a few nods, even from members of the press who'd arrived skeptical. And third, he said, lowering his voice slightly, emergency relief stipends for children of addicts. Not loans, not tax breaks, direct aid. Because a hungry child should not have to wait for someone to get sober before they get fed. Silence held the room again, but this time it wasn't stunned disbelief. It was recognition. Some of you will say this is soft. Others will say it's too religious, JD added. But the truth is, I don't care what Washington thinks is fashionable. I care what works. And what works are communities where people show up, again and again, no matter how ugly the pain gets. A slow shift rippled through the room. Even AOC, once perched with a combat-ready posture, had adjusted. Her eyes narrowed, not in cynicism, but in calculation. This wasn't just another senator posturing. J.D. Vance had come with receipts. He continued, softer now. This act isn't about faith as a sermon. It's about faith as survival. Because I wouldn't be standing here if someone hadn't believed I was worth saving, before I ever looked like I could be. The line didn't land like a clapback. It didn't need to. It simply landed. Cameras flashed, phones buzzed. Pundits watching from home already knew what was coming next. JD had just shifted the debate from emotion to execution. He'd weaponized vulnerability not as a shield, but as a blueprint. The moderator cleared their throat, visibly unsure how to proceed. Senator Vance, would you be submitting this proposal to the Committee on Family Policy Reform? I already did, JD said. They'll receive the full draft in the morning. I didn't bring this to win a debate. I brought it to start a rescue. A hush fell again, no applause this time, just stillness, the kind that settles right before something changes. And for the first time since the debate began, even JD's harshest critics didn't quite know how to strike back. JD didn't sit down. He looked out over the studio, past the glaring lights, past the rows of cameras and press, and spoke with the kind of quiet steadiness that makes a room lean in. Let me tell you what this is really about, he said, flipping to the next page in the folder. It's not about me. It's not about AOC. It's not even about this debate. It's about them. He held up a laminated sheet. On it were 6 photos. Real kids, real eyes looking straight into the lens. Some smiling, some not. Names printed below, with hometowns most of America forgot long ago. Kendra, age 12, lives in a motel off Interstate 40 in Arkansas. Her mother works night shifts at a gas station, still recovering from her 3rd relapse. Kendra brings her little brother to school every morning. He's 5. She braids his hair on the bus because no one else can. A few murmurs rippled across the audience. JD didn't pause. Deshaun, 14, Detroit. He hasn't seen his father in 7 years. His mom? She overdosed twice in the last 18 months. The last thing she whispered to him in the ambulance was, "Don't stop praying, baby." He hasn't. But he's been suspended 3 times. Not because he's violent, but because he's tired. Because he's hungry. JD flipped the page. Maya, 9, Chattanooga. Her grandparents raise her now. She writes letters to her mom every Sunday and folds them into a shoebox labeled Someday. That box is almost full. He looked around again, letting the silence thicken. There are hundreds more, thousands, but these are just the ones whose guardians said yes to sharing. He placed the photos back into the folder like sacred items, careful and slow. Every one of them lives a life I recognize, a life where you grow up fast, where you learn to lie to teachers about why you didn't do your homework. Not because you don't care, but because the lights got cut off again. Where you pray to a God you barely understand, not for a miracle, but for the strength to get through one more day without screaming. His voice stayed level, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. People love to say these kids are broken, that they're doomed to repeat cycles, but I'm standing here because someone saw through all that. He looked directly into the camera now, addressing not the studio, not AOC, not the pundits, but the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms, kitchens, night shifts, and hospital waiting rooms. They're not broken, he said, his voice barely more than a breath. They're unprotected. The phrase echoed in the stillness. AOC, seated across from him, lowered her gaze for the first time all evening. Her jaw tightened, not in opposition, but restraint. A war of emotion flickered across her face. This wasn't politics anymore. This was personal. For all of them. JD stepped back from the podium and closed the folder. I'm not asking anyone to believe what I believe. I'm asking them to believe in these kids. Because until we do, we'll keep having debates like this, full of fire, but empty of rescue. The moderator didn't speak. The room didn't move. For a moment, the stage was no longer a battleground. It was a mirror, and the country was watching its own reflection. JD let the silence breathe for a moment longer. Then he stepped forward again, one hand still resting on the closed folder that had shaken the room just minutes earlier. This is not a conservative bill, he said calmly, and it's not a liberal one either. It's a human one. The statement didn't land like a thunderclap. It didn't need to. It rippled, soft but deep, through the crowd, through the stage, through living rooms across the country. JD scanned the room. I've watched both parties speak about broken systems as if they were accidents, as if they just happened. But we built this, all of us. And if we're brave enough, we can unbuild it and start again. The moderator, visibly moved, leaned back and let the floor remain his. JD continued, the Broken Faith Protection Act isn't about saving votes. It's about saving futures. I'm asking for trauma counselors in schools, because trauma doesn't care if your parents voted red or blue. I'm asking for faith-based grant programs not to preach, but to protect. Because the people who held me together when I was falling apart didn't wear name tags or hold government titles. They were neighbors, volunteers, strangers who remembered I was a child before I was a statistic. A few in the press gallery, once skeptical, were now scribbling furiously. One conservative columnist who had dismissed JD months ago as a preacher in a politician's suit lowered his pen slowly and nodded. A senator seated in the back, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, leaned forward with elbows on knees, eyes locked on JD. Across the aisle, a Republican from Arizona gave a small but unmistakable nod. The murmurs began, quiet at first, then growing. A ripple of agreement, of recognition. Not applause, not yet, but something rarer. Consensus. Even AOC shifted. She leaned toward her aide and whispered, barely audible, "We have to respond." Her aide didn't answer immediately. She was watching JD too. AOC sat straighter, eyes narrowing, not with hostility but with attention. JD wasn't just challenging her platform. He was challenging the boundaries of what this debate was ever meant to be. JD closed his eyes for a beat before speaking again. Look, if anyone here wants to debate me on tax code or federal oversight, I'll show up every time. But tonight isn't about that. Tonight is about whether we are brave enough to say three things out loud. We failed these kids. We ignored their pain. And we can do better. He let the words hang there, like a chord unresolved. For years, I watched politicians argue over funding, while kids like Kendra and Deshaun counted how many meals they had left before asking neighbors for help. And I swore if I ever had a voice, I wouldn't use it to win arguments. I'd use it to win back their futures. The audience finally broke. It wasn't a cheer. It was something heavier, something human. Applause, yes, but wrapped in reflection. The sound of people not just agreeing, but feeling seen. Even AOC clapped once, quietly, to herself. The moderator spoke up for the first time in minutes. Congressman Vance, thank you. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you like to respond? AOC rose slowly, the weight of the moment folding into her steps. The spotlight shifted. It was now her turn. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't preparing to spar. She was preparing to listen. Backstage, the lights were dimmer. The noise from the studio was muffled now, like distant thunder behind a steel door. JD sat alone in a folding chair, elbows on knees, forehead resting on clasped hands. His jacket lay draped over the chair beside him, and his tie was loosened. Not out of style, but surrender. The glow of the monitor next to him replayed a snippet of the debate. His mother's voice echoed faintly. Your belief in God, in me, made me believe again. He exhaled through his nose as if hearing it again still hurt and healed at once. Footsteps approached. He didn't look up at first. He didn't need to. AOC stood just beyond the doorway. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her posture was still upright, but the sharpness in her shoulders was gone. What remained was something gentler. Not defeat, not shame, just clarity. "I owe you an apology, JD." Her voice was quiet. It didn't ask for attention. It offered respect. JD looked up slowly, his face unreadable for a beat. Then he nodded, not curtly but deliberately, like someone who understood that reconciliation wasn't weakness. It was work. "You weren't wrong to question," he said, "just wrong to mock." AOC swallowed. She walked further in, pulled out a chair, and sat across from him, folding her hands on her lap. She didn't argue. For once, she wasn't building a case. "I thought your faith was a weapon," she admitted. "I assumed you'd use it to moralize, to divide. I didn't expect it to be a bridge." JD tilted his head. "Most folks don't." Another silence. But this one wasn't tense. It was necessary. "I've spent my whole life trying to break down systems," AOC said, "and sometimes I forget that people live inside those systems, not just under them. Your story reminded me." JD leaned back, letting her words settle. "You've got your own story too," he said. "Just because I brought mine to the stage doesn't mean yours doesn't matter." "But I didn't," she said almost to herself. "I brought facts. You brought your mother." "She was the fact," JD said gently. "She's the reason I'm not in a ditch or a cell or a casket." AOC blinked fast, then reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her debate notes. She held them up, the edges slightly curled, the ink smudged in places. Then, without ceremony, she folded them in half and placed them on the table beside them. "I came in with talking point," she said, "but I think tonight I need to rewrite my part." JD let out a breath. Not a laugh, not a sigh, but something between them. "You don't need to rewrite it," he said. "Just write it real." She nodded, then glanced toward the curtain. The moderator's voice echoed faintly again, preparing the audience for the final segment. Time was moving forward, whether they were ready or not. "We're about to go back out there," AOC said. "Yeah. You know they'll expect us to fight again." JD stood, straightened his shirt, and met her gaze. "Then let's surprise them." They shared a look, not of alliance but of alignment, not the end of rivalry, but the beginning of mutual recognition. AOC reached for the curtain. JD followed. The lights waited on the other side. So did the country, and for the first time that night, neither of them felt alone in front of it. The green room curtain swayed gently as JD and AOC slipped back into the shadows behind the stage. But instead of heading towards separate prep tables, they stood together by a narrow hallway lined with cases of lighting equipment and forgotten water bottles. Neither seemed in a rush to return to the spotlight. For a moment, they didn't speak. Then, unexpectedly, it was AOC who broke the silence. "I was 9 when my dad died," she said. "Not as a weapon, not as a counterpunch, but as an offering. We couldn't afford to stay in our Bronx apartment anymore. So we moved, my mom, my little brother and me, into a place in Yorktown Heights. The schools were better, but we never really belonged." JD said nothing. He just looked at her. The defiance that often shaped her posture was softened now, but not gone. It had just been folded into something more complex, something lived in. She glanced sideways at him. "You ever have to pretend you were someone else to survive?" JD nodded slowly. "Only every day until I didn't have to." She gave a half smile. Not of amusement, but of understanding. "I used to dress like the other girls at school, smile when I didn't want to. I memorized how they spoke so my accent wouldn't make me smaller." He looked at her, his voice low. "You were trying to be heard." "I was trying not to be erased," she said. "There's a difference." JD leaned back against the wall, arms crossed loosely. "We forget each other's stories. That's how this country forgets itself." She nodded. JD continued. "Some folks think working class pain and minority struggle are in conflict, but they're both about being ignored until the only thing left is to raise your voice or go silent forever." AOC looked down, rubbing her thumb against the edge of her ring. "I've used my voice, sometimes too loudly, sometimes not enough." JD tilted his head. "I used silence like armor, until I realized people were filling in my silence with things I never meant." AOC looked up, and for the first time since the debate began, She didn't see JD as a political opponent. She saw a boy who carried his mother's letter like scripture and turned pain into blueprint. He saw a girl who carried her father's memory through every hearing, every headline, every fight. "You think anything we said tonight really changed someone's mind?" she asked. JD shrugged. "Maybe not minds, but maybe hearts. Maybe that's where we're supposed to start." A pause. AOC bit her lip. "If I drafted a counter-proposal to your bill, not to block it, but to expand it, would you read it?" JD cracked a tired smile. "If you write it like you talk when the cameras are off, I'll read every word." She laughed lightly, a genuine sound in a night filled with applause and sound bites. "You're still going to vote against my climate plan next week, aren't you?" JD smirked. "Almost definitely." They both chuckled, then silence again. Not awkward this time, just full. Beyond the hallway, someone called, "We're back live in 60 seconds. Neither of them moved right away, but something in the air had shifted. Not alliance, not agreement, but acknowledgement. And that was enough. By sunrise, the world had responded. Cable news ran rolling headlines like drum beats. Vance's face sparks newbie partisan push, and the debate that brought Washington to tears. On social media, hashtags like hashtag Faith and Fire and hashtag Common Ground trended across ideological lines. In small towns and big cities, the conversation had shifted. No longer about points scored, but hearts moved. J.D. Vance's office in D.C. was inundated, not with outrage, not with threats, but with letters. One came from a Vietnam veteran in Tulsa. "I've never voted Democrat, never planned to, but you made me remember my brother's struggle after he came home. Thank you." Another, from a single mother in Camden. "I don't share your faith, but I share your fear that our kids are growing up invisible. You gave them a name again." And one scrawled in the careful penmanship of a teenage girl from Iowa, "I showed your video to my dad. He hasn't spoken to me about his past in years. Last night, he sat down and told me everything. You gave me my father back." Even critics, longtime skeptics of JD's ideology, paused. A well-known atheist columnist wrote, "We may differ in belief, but if faith can produce this kind of empathy-driven policy, maybe I've been asking the wrong questions." Meanwhile, across the Capitol, AOC's team confirmed the rumors. She would co-sponsor an amendment to the Broken Faith Protection Act aimed at expanding funding to public schools in trauma-impacted neighborhoods. In a brief statement, she said, "Policy must follow people, and people, not parties, are who we serve." It wasn't a grand coalition. There were still debates to be had, language to be tweaked, skeptics to win over. But something rare had emerged in the static of politics, a moment of visible, if fragile, unity. Inside the Senate chamber that afternoon, two desks, once symbolic of battle lines, now carried identical manila folders. One read Vance, the other Ocasio-Cortez. And though their names were still different, the signatures inside marked the same hope. A hope that somewhere between belief and bureaucracy, America could still remember itself. J.D. Vance stood alone at the center of the Senate floor. The chamber was silent, save for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional shuffle of footsteps along the gallery above. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply stood with the same posture he once held as a boy in Middletown, quiet but determined. "I didn't come here today to win a political battle," he began, his voice steady. "I came here to say something I've waited decades to say, something I promised a woman long gone I would never forget." He held up the letter, worn, faded, folded 100 times, the one his mother had written from that rehab center in 1999. The ink had blurred, but the words had never faded from his mind. He continued, "When my mother wrote this, she was fighting for her life. She thought she'd failed, but the truth is, her trying saved me. And now maybe it can save others too." He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each senator, even the ones who had opposed him. "This bill is not perfect. No bill is, but it's a beginning, a message to every kid watching from a broken home, every parent who feels invisible, every family who wonders if anyone in Washington gives a damn, that we do." His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the final page. And so, with your permission, I want to close not with my words, but with hers. He paused, cleared his throat, and read slowly. JD, if you ever stand where they can hear you, tell them I tried. Tell them we all tried. Silence followed. Not heavy, not awkward, but sacred. A stillness wrapped in reverence, like the moment before the last candle is blown out in a chapel. JD folded the letter again, pressed it to his chest, and nodded once to the chair. The vote was next, but the speech, his speech, was already done. The clerk began the roll call. One by one, senators spoke their votes into the chamber, some with clear voices, some with a tremor. Aye, nay, aye. There was no drama now, no tension like in campaign ads or debate stages, only the quiet gravity of consequence. The camera cut to AOC. Her hand rested gently over her heart. When her name was called, she said, "Aye?" Then looked across the aisle, not at her party, but at JD. He didn't return the look. His eyes stayed on the floor, his lips pressed together as if holding something in. The tally came in. 68 in favor, 32 against. The Broken Faith Protection Act had passed. There were no thunderous cheers, no standing ovations, just the still hum of breath and blinking lights overhead. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause, but earns it. In the gallery, a woman began to cry quietly. Below her, a man took off his veteran's cap and placed it on his chest. Reporters began scribbling. Staffers wiped their eyes. Even the CSPAN cameras seemed to hesitate before pulling back. JD remained seated. He hadn't moved since casting his vote. The letter still sat in his lap. For a long minute, no one approached him. No one interrupted. He had given everything, and the chamber, in a rare act of grace, gave him space to feel it. It was not victory. It was something deeper, closure, and beginning. Outside the Capitol, the sunlight had shifted to gold. The news vans were already parked, satellites humming, microphones extended like spears. JD exited through the side doors. His tie was loosened, his shoulders a little slouched, his steps measured, not triumphant. A cluster of reporters surged forward, their questions colliding over one another. "Senator Vance, do you have a message for the country? What happens next? Do you think this bill will survive budget negotiations?" He paused. For once, the cameras weren't the loudest thing in the space. He looked directly at them and said without a smile, "We just wrote something that might stop a kid from climbing a roof." Then he turned and walked, not toward a podium, not toward a car, just forward. Behind him, the Capitol stood tall, but the moment belonged not to stone or title, but to memory. The screen faded to black. And then, in white letters, slowly, "Faith doesn't need applause. It only asks to be lived." Inspired by a true story. The final image lingered, not of JD, not of AOC, but of a folded letter left on a wooden bench outside the chamber. A legacy not of power, but of trying, of not being heard for years, and still speaking anyway. This story isn't just about politics, it's about people. It reminds us that behind every debate, every policy, there are real lives at stake. JD's transformation and his willingness to open old wounds to heal others shows that leadership doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers truth through pain. And when rivals like AOC listen, when a divided room finds quiet unity, we're reminded of something rare. Progress doesn't require perfection, just courage and a little grace. We all carry stories that shaped us. Some break us, some build us. But what if the story you lived could help someone else stand? What part of your past do you think could be someone else's hope? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.